Hello, and thank you for coming. I'm Dr. Jane Morgan. I'm the Executive Director of the COVID Task Force for Piedmont Healthcare, and I'll tell you a little bit more about my background later, but I really want to introduce these outstanding marquee esteemed panelists that I have here today. And I am going to start with the bio of Dr. David Ridley here at the end. Dr. Ridley is a professor of the practice, the Dr. and Mrs. Frank A. Riddick Jr. Research Fellow, and the faculty director for the health sector management at Duke University's Fuqua School of Business. He studies healthcare innovation, production, and prices. He's especially interested in how to encourage development of drugs and vaccines for neglected diseases. David was the lead author of the paper proposing the Priority Review Voucher Program, which became law and created a market of more than $1 billion for drug development for neglected diseases. His research has been funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the National Institutes of Health. David teaches courses on healthcare policy and strategy to Duke University graduate students and received a doctorate in economics from Duke University as well. So thank you very much and welcome. And to my immediate left is Dr. George Painter, who is a professor in the Department of Pharmacology and Chemical Biology at the Emory School of Medicine, director of the Emory Institute for Drug Development, and CEO of Drug Innovation Ventures at Emory Drive. Dr. Painter has over 30 years of experience in the discovery and development of pharmaceutical agents in the biotechnology and large pharmaceutical company sectors. Before coming to Emory, he was the CEO of Chimerix, the executive vice president at Triangle Pharmaceuticals, wherein in these positions he worked on discovery and development of antiviral agents to treat HSV, HIV, HBV, and HCV. We can also add to that, as an inventor with more than 45 patents, 6 of which have led to approved commercially available drugs or combination drugs, we can add to that COVID, SARS-CoV-2. So I am very happy to have these panelists with us today, and we really want to focus on the speed of drug development and discovery, and what does that look like? And certainly we are here somewhere within this COVID pandemic. We certainly don't know what is coming, but there have been many lessons learned in the last 2.5 years. At the beginning, I will tell you a bit about my background. I am a cardiologist by training, but also spent many years in industry and research and development at both Solvay and Abbott Labs, and then transitioned into business development in acquisitions and licensing of compounds. I have been at Piedmont for the last 7 years, where I led their cardiovascular research program and then strategy for all of research before I transitioned over to lead the COVID task force. So when we look at what has happened with the development of these vaccines, we absolutely understand the drug development process that seemed very, very fast to all of us. And that was because when we look at the 4 phases of development, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and phase 4, what we saw was an influx of resources. And by resources, we mean cash, we mean money, that came into Moderna and Pfizer by and large to accelerate that process. In doing so, the money de-risks the process. Companies generally spend about $1 billion to bring a drug to market. And so they want to make certain that all of the data at the end of each phase is absolutely sound before you go to the next phase, because they are investing hundreds of millions of dollars in each phase. If you have unlimited resources, that de-risks the process, because now the money is not yours, and you increase your patent life. And if, in fact, you get to the end of the process and the data is negative, you have not risked anything. It has not been your money. And so with that process, we saw a great acceleration in vaccines coming to us in the middle of an emergency under terms that we now know very comfortably, but at the time we did not know: emergency use authorization. So that is the background under which we're going to have this really robust conversation with these great panelists. And so I'm just going to start to say, how do we go faster? Should we go faster? And that's a very open-ended question. You can take it however you want, and I'll start with Dr. Painter.
Well, in 2019, December, we had a therapeutic agent ready for IND submission. And to Dr. Morgan's point, at that point, we had about $40 million of federal contract funding in. And at the beginning of 2020, we were going to submit an IND for respiratory viral disease. And the indication was flu. But the secondary indications were SARS and MERS. So by the time the etiologic agent had been identified as another coronavirus, we were contacted by FDA, and the HHS said, well, are you going to file an IND? So at that point, I think that's where government money, which is encumbered by government process, becomes a little bit limiting. So that's why you see, in our case, we moved to the private sector, and the vaccines are pushed through from the Pfizers and Modernas because there aren't all the government. So we very quickly found a biotech. They brought $300 million to the table, pushed it through phase 2. So I think we did, in 18 months, 4 years of work. And I think a lot of that, to your point, is facilitated by the ready availability of capital, private enterprise seeing the opportunity against the background of immediate need in government purchase, and then moved it to Merck, who did it worldwide. So I think, yes, things were accelerated. I think really the biggest factor was regulatory agencies in the United States and the United Kingdom coming in and working in real time. So I think it was a rather fast response. I think the problem is establishing definitive clinical trials against that kind of background.
Right. Dr. Ridley, should we go faster? Are we doing the right thing, or is it time to pull the reins in?
Great questions. I want to talk about speed for both government and companies. So first of all, with regard to government, the FDA authorized coronavirus vaccine for emergency use in 3 weeks. Previous fastest time was 11 months. So 11 months down to about 1 month. Can we regularly go that fast? Maybe. Depends on how resourced the FDA is. It depends on resources, and also whether the FDA has to reanalyze all the data or not. FDA loves to reanalyze the data. Other countries don't do that. Will that stick? We've demonstrated that FDA can get things done in a month. Will that stick? I don't know. Dr. Painter will remember well the HIV/AIDS epidemic, when HIV/AIDS activists said, why the heck are you taking so long, FDA? Let's move faster. That's when we got priority review. Priority review didn't exist until the HIV/AIDS crisis and activists saying, you need to move faster. It stuck back in 1992. Maybe it could stick again. So that's government. On the commercial side, you both have addressed this quite nicely. I think companies can go faster, but they're probably going to fail. And so, as you mentioned, R&D costs, let's say, $1 billion. Going faster costs more than $1 billion. And you're probably going to fail. And so you've got to either de-risk it, as you mentioned earlier, or have a company willing to take that risk.
Did you have something you wanted to add, Dr. Painter?
Well, I think the question of can you routinely go that fast, I think it's a definitive no.
Because we're resource strapped.
Because we're resource strapped. And I think, again, yes, FDA did fine, but regulators in the UK were much better because they reviewed in real time. I don't think you'll find circumstances, for instance, for chronic disease, cardiovascular drugs, where people will do that.
Right.
So I think it's a phenomenon associated with acute need under things like a pandemic.
Right. And priority is key, and I think you bring up a good point, and something that we all know just in our own daily lives, is that it's much easier to risk someone else's money than your own. And so during the pandemic, we were able to risk other people's money. But now when we get back to sort of real life, where the companies are going to have to fund this themselves, then that probably is not going to be a good business model for sustainability unless you can guarantee that every compound is going to be commercially viable, and you're going to have enough patent life. So when we look at combination drugs, I know you all are familiar with those, and we know certainly that combination drugs can increase compliance, therefore improve outcomes, certainly in more marginalized communities as well when access is an issue. Where do you think we're going with those combination drugs, and what do you think about them? I'll just, again, open-ended question.
Well, I'll jump in right away because I was the project leader for Combivir, you know, and I think in the antiviral area, combination drugs are almost de rigueur, right? They protect you, you get more efficacy and they protect you against resistance.
Combination drugs meaning more than one drug is in the tablet. So instead of taking 2 tablets, you'll take 1 tablet with both drugs in it. Or instead of taking 3 tablets, you'll take 1 tablet with all 3 drugs in it. So that's what we mean when we say combo drugs.
Right, and I think, again, in a public health emergency, you want something that doesn't require substantial medical infrastructure, and that's self-administratable. FedEx can deliver it to your door. But just for a moment, to go back to something you said, the cost of capital. When you raise money, it's expensive, and if you're out there trying to raise money right now, you know that it's very expensive. And with the Fed just raised the rates again, so money's going to go up. I think the U.S. government, the Biden administration just funded what's called AVID, Antiviral Drug Development for Pandemic Preparedness.
And congratulations to Dr. Painter. He's one of the awardees, a multi-million-dollar, I think $45 million?
54.
54, I had the numbers inverted, so.
And we're partnered with Georgia State, so it's an Atlanta phenomenon. And I think the government is trying, but it always has to be picked up by pharma in the end. And pharma has to put a lot of money, and there's lost opportunity too, right? They move assets. So I don't know. I just think this business-wise is going to be tough to sustain.
Dr. Ridley, maybe you could talk to us about vouchers. Maybe you could just even explain to us as the lead author. Maybe you could talk to us just about vouchers and what they mean and how that really works and how that might improve the speed of drug development.
Yeah, my pleasure. And Dr. Painter can speak to this from the real world also, but I'll tell you from my perspective about this. So I mentioned that Congress created priority review back in 1992 after the HIV/AIDS epidemic. 15 years later, we proposed the priority review voucher. So we wrote a paper and it became law. And the law says that if you develop a drug or vaccine for a neglected disease, you get priority review for that product and a bonus priority review for a different product. So there's 2 drugs for every voucher. You develop a drug for onchocerciasis or leishmaniasis, and you get a voucher for faster review of, say, your HIV combination drug like Biktarvy. So Biktarvy, a multi-billion-dollar drug that used a voucher. One for, say, a tropical disease, used for a blockbuster disease. And so if you have a voucher, the FDA will review this drug in 6 months instead of 10. So you get, instead of a 10-month review, you get 6 months. You get 4 months shaved off. You have to pay the FDA an extra user fee of $2 million. FDA says it costs them $2 million to go from a 10-month review to a 6-month review, but it's worth $100 million. So the last 20 or so vouchers, I think, have sold for about $100 million. So, for example, a little not-for-profit in Australia won a voucher for a river blindness drug, sold it. They didn't publicize the price, but I know the people is around $100 million for somebody else to use it to speed their drug. So we've been talking about whether FDA can go faster. I think there's some inefficiency there that they can do it for $2 million and it's worth $100 million. But the good news is our idea grabs that inefficiency and applies it to encourage drugs for neglected diseases. That was our 2007 law, and then in 2012, Congress added rare pediatric diseases, and then in 2016, Congress added medical countermeasures. I hope that makes some sense. 2 drugs for every voucher, you do a good deed, and you get faster review of something else.
And these vouchers can be sold as well
Yes.
if you don't want to use them, so the vouchers have value. And then the value that you have back to the community or back to society, and I mean the global society, is that you're now developing drugs that don't necessarily have priority. They may not impact Americans as much. I'm saying that tongue in cheek as we see monkeypox coming in that doesn't impact us. But here we have more cases here and in Western Europe. But just traditionally, there are specific viruses, infectious agents, bacteria that we don't necessarily see here. And so they don't get priority review because the people who are impacted are people who are out of our view, our line of sight, but they also don't have resources to purchase expensive drugs if the companies produce them. So there's not a lot of infrastructure. And so to Dr. Ridley's credit, developed a program that the FDA understands. And how can we encourage doing the right thing from a humanitarian perspective, but also then continue to improve the development of drugs? And how can we develop, drugs for populations that we may not see here and diseases that we may not see here? And again, I say that a bit with reticence because we now are beginning to see a migration of diseases in populations where we have not seen these diseases before, and will they behave in these populations differently as well? So I think this voucher program is very novel and very interesting, and you have some practical experience with it, Dr. Painter, correct?
And I think, it really has impacted the funding of biotechs, because when they sell that voucher to like pharma, and pharma has a blockbuster, that 4 months probably gets a drug on the market 4 months sooner. And if it has the $2 billion peak sale, you can see why they would pay $100 million for it. So yes, we've dealt with that. But one thing that comes out of this that's interesting about what you were just talking about, and that's neglected disease.
Right.
The whole world's changed. And, we see how interconnected it is when we watched Ebola come from West Africa with patients. Recently, Lassa fever showed up in the UK and was transmitted person to person. So I think with the way the world's structured, population, rapid international movement, food movement, what was neglected and geographically isolated is now of global significance. Most of these viruses are RNA viruses. And the interesting thing about that, unlike other viral diseases, the drugs so far are broadly active. So there's something called dual use. So you can address the issue for a neglected disease. For example, one we're working on now for rhinovirus in COPD patients, but it also treats enterovirus 68 that it causes acute flaccid myelitis, and also works against hemorrhagic fevers in the Rift Valley in Africa. So I think, there's going to be broader activity, dual use. If you take dual use plus the voucher, you see a lot of value, and then you can develop something for neglected disease and pass it off to a commercial entity. And it's attractive to them for those reasons.
And you bring up a good point. With acute flaccid myelitis, this is one of the conditions that's often, well, not often, I guess, recently, because we don't really see that here as doctors here in the United States, quite frankly. But acute flaccid myelitis has been confused with polio infections here. And the patient who was impacted by polio with paralysis, and part of the reason that it's confused is we haven't seen it, we haven't trained on it, we don't treat it, we don't really learn about it in medical school. It is, an eradicated disease, but this is very important to understand what viruses mean and how they're moving through Maybe there's a resurgence of different kinds. We'll have to watch that. But it's going to be very, very, very critical for us to understand the capabilities of our infrastructure, the programs that are in place, and how we can bring drugs and other medical therapeutics to availability to our population quickly in the case of an emergency, as we see monkeypox as an example, even though not an emergency, but we see it here on our shores, where by and large we really haven't seen it before. And we're starting to see this bubble up of polio as well in the wastewater in New York. What does that mean, and what does that herald for other viruses coming? How quickly can we respond with our processes that are very hierarchical, right? Very staged, very controlled, a lot of quality metrics in place. That's for our safety, but that doesn't really work well in an emergency. And so that's where we're trying to have that balance. The FDA is really in place to safeguard the safety of Americans, and they take that seriously. And their interpretation of that is they go very slowly and they're very methodical. So when they give an approval, it has been thoroughly, thoroughly vetted. But we see that that model doesn't necessarily apply to every aspect that we need. And especially at a conference like this, where we're looking at innovation, we need some things to move much more quickly without sacrificing safety. And so these, have been, great points that you're making. A question that I would ask as we look at some of, the bivalent vaccines that are coming out, as you may or may not know, we don't have human clinical trials for these boosters. They have followed a model of animal results, animal data, making the boosters available in this attempt to accelerate the model such that we can get vaccines into arms while the variant is still circulating, as opposed to 2 years of us chasing these variants. By the time we get the vaccines in, the Delta variant has moved to Omicron. By the time we get Omicron, we've chased Alpha, we chased Beta, so we were always behind. So they said, let's try to get them in the arms while Omicron is here. What do you think about that? I'll start with Dr. Painter. With this model of we are providing boosters and the human clinical trial data has not yet been completed.
Well, I'm wary of it. I'm wary of it because of safety. And then it's interesting you bring up monkeypox, because there's a vaccine, ACAM 2000, that's stockpiled and that people are clamoring for. So in limited testing, the military is still vaccinated for smallpox because it's been weaponized, and there's worry that it'll about be released. There was 12% myocarditis. And so if that vaccine were used without due consideration of the side effects in a lot of the population that are getting severe monkeypox, you might have as much severe morbidity from side effects as you have from the disease. So I get it. I understand antigenicity, and they're doing antibody titers and seeing it's fine. But there are two issues. One, there is no safety profile. And two, in vaccines in general, what do you do about the people that won't take them? That's why we have polio again. How do you work against that background effectively? I know I expanded on it, but
No, absolutely.
but those are considerations, right, that you have to have. Vaccines aren't the pandemic panacea. You've watched it roll out, particularly with RNA viruses. So now they scramble to speed it up to try to address every variant that comes out without due consideration to safety. Is that right? I'm just wary of it.
Dr. Ridley?
I'm not a real scientist, I'm an economist. Economists like to do cost-benefit analysis, and so I think cost-benefit analysis is almost always appropriate, but we could use it in this case as well. We could think about what's the risk of myocarditis, and what's the benefit in terms of protection for that individual and for society. And the benefits, I think, will change over time depending on how hot COVID is at the time. So If the risks from COVID have diminished a lot, that changes that cost-benefit analysis. If the risks are really high, then that should also be considered. So we should weigh these costs against the potential benefits.
No, risk benefit is everything in this. And so that's a very good point. I take that point. You know, the RNA viruses that are starting to present, they change very rapidly. And so this whole thing about efficacy, how do you test the vaccine? How do you test the drugs? The presentation of the disease is polyphenotypic clinically. I mean, when people started getting COVID, they had vascular disease, they had pulmonary, they had lung compromise, people were on ventilators. So against this changing background of the virus, it's mutating, it's changing. The patient population is changing. There are sociologic issues with what's severe disease in areas, and you've got to test these things in real time to benefit. And I think that's the big challenge. That's the biggest challenge we face. Not coming up with another mRNA that's, causes antigenemia. I mean, what do you do clinically to test it and to find the risk-benefit ratio?
And in putting that in context of speed, which is sort of what this panel is focused on. Again, the risk-benefit ratio, how in the middle of a pandemic that we're trying to stem, and we recognize the social problems in that there's a percentage of the population that didn't get vaccinated, it continued to perpetuate variants. And so then we were in the situation where we're continuing to chase variants with new therapeutics like your molnupiravir, we haven't talked about today, Paxlovid, and other vaccines. And now we're at a point where let's do boosters, the same model as the flu vaccine, by the way. The annual flu vaccine does not undergo human clinical trials. It is modified every single year. We get a new flu vaccine every year. It doesn't undergo human clinical trials. So there is precedence for this type of annual immunization. But it means that we are moving quickly. And we want to examine what that means here on this panel. So as we close, I'd like for Dr. Painter and then Dr. Ridley maybe just give some closing thoughts of what you may have about this topic and any closing thoughts you'd like to leave with anyone.
Look, an interesting point of this whole affair has been voices that were amplified by the internet, okay? So there are a lot of armchair people out there with some rather bizarre opinions and radical opinions that follow our dysfunctional political system. But be that as it may, I think overall the process was astounding. Yes. And I think it was a good performance on the part of the government, on the part of academics, and all parties involved to get vaccines and countermeasures out there so quickly that truly were effective. And that's how I'd like to close with my thoughts.
I just second that. It was incredible. So I was pessimistic about getting a shot in my arm so quickly. And for one thing, I was too pessimistic about the mRNA technology in Moderna. I'm so glad I was wrong there. I was pessimistic about our government. I'm so glad I was wrong there. That was an incredible success. Our government put a lot of money forward in Operation Warp Speed, billions of dollars. And we mentioned earlier that they gave money to Moderna, they gave money to Pfizer, they gave money to others too that failed. They wasted money, but they wasted a few billions here and there to save a lot of lives and save tens or hundreds of billions later. So I'm so proud of our government and Operation Warp Speed for making those investments, so proud of those scientists and the companies. If I can be greedy, I want to make two other points.
No,
okay. So Dr. Painter mentioned dual use. He said it's great if you have a drug that's helpful in this market and can also make money over here. Dr. Morgan also mentioned that it costs about $1 billion to bring a drug to market. Remember, I mentioned $100 million for the priority review voucher, and Dr. Morgan said $1 billion for R&D. Those don't quite match up. So we need dual use, or we need other incentives. So we got a smallpox drug, we got a smallpox vaccine, not because they could make money in the commercial market, they couldn't, but because there was a pull of the priority review voucher and there was a push of upfront government funding and promises to buy those drugs and vaccines that we'd probably never use. Oh, but wait, it turns out we did need them with monkeypox. And so we need multiple mechanisms, whether it's the dual use that Dr. Painter mentioned, or whether it's some government funding, some government push or pull mechanisms. And then the last thing I just want to say is, we keep talking about drugs that, well, we talked about these diseases that we thought would really never affect us. But because of globalization, as you said, because of a variety of factors, global warming, a lot of these diseases found in hot places are making it their way here. So by us helping people around the world in warmer places, we're actually helping ourselves.
Amen.
Excellent point. And, you know, just to also remember what excellent points Dr. Painter and Dr. Ridley have brought up is that the point is also neglected diseases can be addressed. And these are not just populations that are sort of off of our shores and out of sight. Many neglected diseases are right here in this country, right here in front of you. Rare disease, a lot of suffering, and innumerable number where we have a dearth of therapies because it's not in the business or financial interest of companies to develop therapeutics for a small number of people. That's not the business model. And so we need to think about that again with regard to where we are with humanity. And Dr. Painter and Dr. Ridley are great examples of pushing the envelope, coming up with novel ideas for how can we encourage our government as well as our corporations to move in a different direction at times, but also maintain their business interests. And I think I will applaud both of you for working in that sector and moving in that direction. So thank you very much for coming to this panel. I appreciate it.
The game on the floor there.